Good evening and welcome everyone, particularly Professor Maitrayee Choudhuri, the President of ISS, Professor Vivek, who is the Treasurer, and also the other MC members, RC coordinators and others who are joining this session. I welcome you all, and particularly the RC6 members and others who are joining this session right now and others who will join later. This is the first online interaction we are doing under RC6 Sociology of Religion. And I am very grateful to Professor Tanweer Fazal, who agreed to deliver this very important lecture on a very important topic. And I'm sure also carrying on from his book on the minority conundrum, which was published, I think, last year. There's a lot of insight that we in the RC and also in the larger sociological body can gain from the insights that he would be bringing into this lecture. So I'm very grateful to you, sir, for accepting this invitation. So how we will proceed is now my colleague and also a member of the RC6, Dr. Sonali Wakde, would give very short introductions of the chairperson and the resource person, Professor Tanweer. And then Professor Maitrayee Choudhuri would chair the rest of the session and also moderate the discussions. What I suggest is that those of you who can have the queries as the lecture is going on, if you can actually put them in the question answer or chat box, we can take them all together. Or at the conclusion of the lecture, we may be able to also give chance for, unmuting the mic and taking a few queries. So that's it. Now I give it over to Dr. Sonali.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph, sir. Good evening, one and all. I'm Dr. Sonali Wakade, here to introduce our today's guest formally. First, I would like to introduce our chair of this session, Professor Maitrayee Choudhuri, madam. Professor Maitrayee Choudhuri, madam, is retired professor from JNU, and she is currently the president of ISS. Her areas of interest are gender, media, and academia. I would like to welcome you, ma'am, for this special lecture, and also thank you for agreeing to chair the session and moderate the discussion. Now I take this opportunity to introduce University of Hyderabad. Earlier he taught at the University New Delhi and at Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolutions and Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. His interest lies in the history and theory of nationalism, minority studies, and the study of state practices and collective violence. He is the author of Practices of the State, Muslims, Law, and Violence in India, 3 essays, 2024. Mobilities and Marginalities Among Muslims of India, Elusive Citizenship, co-edited by Routledge in 2023. The Minority Conundrum, Living in Majoritarian Times, edited by Penguin in 2020. Nation, State and Minority Rights in India, Comparative Perspectives on Muslim and Sikh Identities, Routledge in 2015. And Minority Nationalism in South Asia, edited by Routledge in year 2012. Dr. Tanweer Fazal research paper had appeared in edited volume and some of the key journals of social sciences. He frequently intervenes in the public debate on matters of social justice, minority rights, state politics, collective violence, and social movements. So I welcome you, sir, for this online event organized by RC6, Sociology of Religion, ISS, and also thank you for agreeing to deliver a special online lecture on the topic, the making of minorities, conceptual history, and sociological complexities. Now I request Professor Maitrayee Choudhuri, madam, to take over the session and proceed further. Over to Maitrayee, madam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sonali. Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. I'm really very happy that the RC on religion has started the series. I just have a brief comment to make that I was very keen on initiating these online lectures, basically to strengthen the research as important sites for new scholarship, mentoring, discussion through the year, instead of confining itself only during the conferences. So I'm really delighted that many of the research committees have begun. All the talks will be recorded and uploaded on the website. So we are planning to develop a kind of archive on the website of the ISS, which could then be accessed across all regions and countries at one's own convenience. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy now to invite Dr. Tanweer Fazal to start his presentation.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Dr. Joseph. Thank you, Sonali, for a generous introduction. It is a great honor to deliver a lecture in the RC on sociology of religion. Thank you for having me over. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible. They will make you host, sir, now. Then you can present, and then you'll have to give the host right back to the Indian Sociological Society afterwards.
Yes, that I can do.
Yeah,
but the first thing, however, is that the share option is still not open.
That's why she'll just make you host now. You can go.
Yeah. So this question, the making of minority, conceptual history and sociological complexities, it also relates to, in certain sense, the kind of context in which we live, both political and social context. And as a result, we're constantly, expected to reflect on some of the existing paradigms, some of the existing categories, and to understand the implication as well as the extent to which the influence that they have had on scholarship itself. So minority, the term, the minority, the moment we get to hear, it's not only just an analytical category which intellectuals or theorists have, put their thoughts together and reflected upon. Minority is also a general descriptive category, and as a result, this makes the task far more complex for any scholarly understanding of it, because already in the public domain there are multiple ideas of what constitutes a minority which is present, and as a result, to be able to to uncover and unpack the category itself, and then to try to understand it through the complexities which it creates, and the way in which it has historically unfolded itself becomes a bit of a challenge.
Sir, excuse me, your host now. You can share the screen.
Oh, great. So I'll just try to do that. And is it now visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
So as it is, the title of this talk is The Making of a Minority, Conceptual History and Sociological Complexity. Now, what I've tried to do in this particular talk is that I'm not going into details of the making of any particular minority as such. For my thesis, which I worked under Professor Maitrayee Choudhuri and Professor Uman, so I looked into two different communities and went into the history of understanding how they emerge as a community themselves. These two were one, understood as largely in the predominant discourse as in an Indic category. Nowadays, we are, punished with this kind of an idea or circulation of this kind of idea very frequently, that what constitutes Indic knowledge and what doesn't. So there's a predominant sort of a framework or a hegemonic framework about Indic versus non-Indic, and I tried to test that through two different minority communities. One considered to be, Indic, and the other non-Indic. The classic case of being a non-Indic is, of course, the Muslims. The Christians do also qualify in it. Whereas I keep these two categorizations within quotes. And the Sikhs were chosen as the other group. And I tried to understand the kind of a vacillation which has gone into history in the making of the Sikh or Muslim identity. This vacillation in terms of them claiming to be a minority in a particular situation and a nation in another situation altogether. And that was one attempt to understand from a very sociological comprehension of this kind of a politically loaded term such as a minority, vis-a-vis the discourse, predominant discourse of nationalism. In this talk, I simply wish to bring it to the table. Certain kind of complexities associated with the category minority itself, and I would like to go into a bit of its conceptual history, its early beginning in, as I locate, in the politics of Western Europe, and how it traveled to various different geographical locations and took different kinds of forms in different contexts. If the paradox which we are faced with when we come to defining what constitutes a minority in India is that the huge diversity which we have, and to the extent that there are also arguments which would suggest that in India each community is so internally divided, including if we consider Hindus as the majority, say 80% or something, who return in the census as followers of Hindu faith, but at the same time they too are do not constitute a single community as such. And when they, in the absence of there being any singular majority, how do we then come to understand of what constitutes a minority? So as it is there on the screen, there are more than 3,000 castes, tribal groupings. Even if we consider, say, Christians, one of the smallest religious minority in India, but if they constitute a majority in at least 3 different those small states, such as Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikhs too, merely 2% in the entire population, but Punjab alone, they constitute more than 50%. Muslims are spread across the country and constitute a majority in, say, Jammu and Kashmir. Now not a state anymore. Besides, there have been multiple connotations and conflations. We are given to understand that there are also theoretical attempts at defining women as a minority, referring to their powerlessness. The term sexual minority has become quite popular, referring to the communities or practices, sexual practices which are non-heteronormative. Similarly, disabled rights activists as well as theorists have come to argue that how disabled too could constitute a minority as such. And among the theorists, I would particularly name, say, for example, Maitrayee, who in 1989 came to argue that there are 4 different kinds of minorities in India, within which he would include the caste groups as well. However, he also pointed out at the complexities of including these groups as minorities. If we go back to the early history of the emergence of minority as a category, I try to correlate it with the rise of the framework of the nation states. This goes back to the period of 17th century, 17th to 18th century, up till the 19th century, kind of a reorganization in Europe of the emergence of new kinds of sovereigns and nation states. The Treaty of Westphalia being one of the important, ruptures in that context, which came to define the rights of the prince, the Holy Roman Empire as a binding force amongst the princes of Catholic as well as Protestant faiths collapsed, and we found the emergence of very well-defined national boundaries and the rise of national churches also to in some situation. It was in this context that the idea of minority as communities which were not part of the cultural nation, predominant cultural nation, what would be their rights and how would they be considered? Because this was the period of also the war between different kinds of sects within Christianity. So in the early stage, the minority right was restricted to the religious right, which essentially meant that the Catholics were free to practice the religion within Protestant areas, and the Protestants are free to practice their religion within the Catholic areas. One of the major developments in Europe in late 19th century Europe was, we all familiar with this this whole episode of Dreyfus being a French Jewish army officer who was incarcerated on suspicion of being seditious, and jailed for 4 or 5 years term, sent to a penal colony. However, new revelations revealed that he was falsely targeted, and particularly because of his Jewish identity. This, across Europe, created new kind of fervor about the rights of minorities and their protections. And we have many theorists, including Zola, as well as later on, Bruno Boer and Karl Marx's debate on the Jewish question also has influence of this whole backdrop. Sorry, not later on, it was earlier, but later on, this debate also came to be to have an important impact on the formulation of minority and the argument centering the construct of minority itself. Why I try to connect the idea of minority with that of the emergence of nation states is that, one, with the emergence of nation states, this whole idea of national public and national culture also acquired a certain kind of a preeminence, and it was assumed that every nation had a right to have a state of its own, and not only had a right to have a state of its own, was to be constituted around a singularity of culture and cultural practices. Language was probably the fulcrum of which, but there were also elements of religion, etc. If we go back into history, there have been earlier kinds of attempts at extending certain kinds of rights to communities which were smaller in numbers and were not necessarily part of the predominant community. And that was prior to the emergence of nationalism. I go back to, say, for example, the millet system under the Ottoman Turks. This was around from the 14th, 15th century onwards, that it is argued, although there are a lot of debates about it also, that whether it exactly existed or not, or it is something which only is part of the theorist's imagination. However, the framework of the millet system was that within the Ottoman Empire, which was essentially, which drew its legitimacy on the basis of religion as the defender of Islam or something, it founded, considered to have founded the caliphate, but at the same time, it extended certain kinds of protections to the communities, such as the Jews and the Christians, who were supposed to have, who were allowed to have their affairs run by their own religious laws, affairs which we now call them as personal law or something like that. Although they did not have equality in terms of acquiring political offices, but at the same time, the state played a role of non-interference in the cultural practices. This also led to the emergence of certain kind of certain groups within these communities who saw themselves as, say, the spokespersons or claimed a certain kind of authority or fiefdom over these minority groups. While it had its own problems, but nevertheless, the early beginning of minority protection, many a times people go back to this part of history. However, the term minority had not emerged as such. These were communities. These were communities of a different kind. In the Islamic language, they were referred to as dhimmis. Dhimmis are those who are people of the book, the part of the Abrahamic religion, who have to be protected and may not necessarily be required to submit. So, but the rise of nationalism, and that is the reason why I'm trying to connect the emergence of minority question with the rise of nationalism. The rise of nationalism created new kinds of pressures within this millet system. The millet system, with the extended rights to minority groups to have their own ways of worship as well as to protect their identity, etc., was now under pressure. Nationalist upsurge in Turkey required everyone to merge their identity within this idea of Turkish nationalism, Turkish language, etc. And in this context, those who were of the minority faith were now being seen as disloyal, because nation state, as Rupert Emerson argues, claims itself to be the terminal community, that where your ultimate loyalty has to lie. And this is what was the demand which the nationalists now started making on the smaller, on the minor faiths of Turkey. And as a result, you see that there are various kinds of violence, etc., too, took place. One of which was the ugliest episode in that part of the world, that is referred to as the Armenian genocide, where a large number of people of Armenian origin, Christians largely, came to be targeted. This is the period of around 1914-15 in Europe. So while this was the background, we also know that from the 19th century, early 19th century onwards, in different parts of Europe, the Jewish question had also emerged in a big way. I have always referred to the Dreyfus affair, and similarly, many other theorists had started writing on the question of the Jewish problem, taking different sides. A liberal framework demanded that the Jews give up their particularistic identity and merge their identity in the larger secular state, as Bruno Boer, with whom Marx had his debate, would argue. But others would try to insist that the political emancipation does not necessarily require that one had to submit to predominant identity. So given this background, then we do see that there has been a whole attempt as international legal instruments to try to understand the question of minorities and then offer certain kind of solutions to it. However, it remains again, however, it remains again one of the very complex problems, very intricate one, even in the international, global, institutions such as the UN, etc. Because you see the Declaration of Human Rights took place immediately after the foundation of the UN. But the Declaration of Minority Rights took no less than 40 years. And it still continues to be a minor element so far as when it compares to the Declaration of Human Rights. Many states continue to have their own problems with it in terms of the definition of minority, such as the former Yugoslavia resisted the UN definition of minorities, arguing that the minority cannot be equal to the majority or have equal rights as the majority. So these are the complexities which have continued to affect minority conceptualization as well as its implication. within sociology or social science understanding of what constitutes a minority, as concepts emerge in particular historical context, however, they also attempt to transcend that context. So given this backdrop, there have been various different kinds of conceptualizations of what or who constitutes a minority. The South African case where, the white settlers, though in a minority, were in power, and, and we are all familiar with the apartheid regime. So this led to a new kind of a question that whether number can define who constitutes a minority. Although the idea minority immediately gives you the figure of a smaller community and a larger community, but now the numerical criterion was looked at with certain kind of a suspicion that whether it is sufficient or whether it is critical to the understanding of minority. The South African case definitely demanded that the idea of power or discrimination needs to be introduced in the definition of what constitutes a minority. And therefore you see someone like Louis Wirth, who is early one of the theorists of nationalism as well as minority, argues that minorities are people who, because of the difference in their cultural practices, are meted out for unequal treatment, and they're objects of collective discrimination. So here the statistics takes a backseat, and the question of power, question of unequal treatment, etc., takes, it becomes more important. But there have also been problems. For instance, in Indian history itself, the Parsis have, in the Constituent Assembly, resisted to be defined as a minority. Not only in Indian Constituent Assembly, even in the Pakistan Constituent Assembly, the Parsi representative rose to say that Parsis are not a minority, but rather would like to merge with the national majority. So they did, by which they wished to argue that they did not want any special rights. Now, so this created sort of a situation in which whether communities would like to be defined as a minority or not. And hence, Lepons comes to an argument that we need to distinguish between those who are minorities by will and those who are minorities by votes. This is true, of course, that minority gives a suggestion of helplessness. It is a sort of an idea which vis-a-vis one who is a national gives an idea of being inferior to a certain extent. And that is why Jinnah in one of his speeches says that why from minority rights are you now moving to claim yourself as a nation? And he responded to this question by saying, by claiming ourselves to be a nation, we are not equal to others. While so long as we are minorities, which we could only look towards protection, but now we can claim equal rights. So amongst communities also, there have been various different kinds of opinions about whether they should be defined as a minority or not. Amongst Muslims, for instance, when I was doing my field work, there were many Muslims who were arguing that Muslims are not a minority, but second largest majority. Incidentally, we've also heard this from other sources nowadays. Many times, those from the Hindutva, framework argue that we should stop considering Muslims as a minority and extending special rights to them because they are only a second largest majority. So there are various different kinds of then opinions within communities too. And hence Lepons comes to argue that let's then make a distinction between whether someone is minoritized, a community is minoritized, whereas it wished itself to be integrated with the larger national community, or whether, comes to argue for a distinct, community framework on its own. So this kind of a distinction for theorists is important to understand the process of minoritization itself. We also have, various different kinds of theorizations on what constitutes a minority. But nevertheless, there are certain things which come to have a commonality. One is that there's an insistence that minorities are a cultural community. And therefore, the focus is on racial, linguistic, ethnic differences, or religious as well differences. Secondly, the question of powerlessness, that a minority is a community which is powerless or suffers on accounts of the power deficits, is also has come to certain theorists have come to certain kind of agreement on this. And thirdly, that the minority is a relational category. A relational category because for a minority to be a minority, there has to be a majority as well. A majority which is dominant, from which the minority feels a certain kind of threat, whether in terms of cultural exclusion or cultural subjugation, or in terms of exclusions from social, political, and economic life, etc. In the Indian constitutional framework, we have Article 29 and 30, which refer to special minority rights. These are the only two articles which refer to the minorities and their rights. But the minority is not as such defined, except for making references to religious and linguistic communities. What Article 29 and 30 does is that sees the minority essentially as a cultural community. And hence, it extends to the minority groups the right to have their own educational institutions so as to preserve their culture. Now, this provision has had its own problems. There is endless litigations around it. Litigations are around one question: whether a minority institution established by a minority can continue to draw funds from state exchequer or not. The litigation is also around the question as to whether that community which established a minority institution has a right to have a control over admissions, recruitments, etc., as well as the curriculum. And the question that when the Article 29 and 30 refer to specifically to the protection of culture for in the establishment of educational institutions, whether these are, whether one can have different kinds of institutions established for this purpose, such as, professional institutions, etc., which have no, relation to the idea of protection of culture, etc. So these kinds of debates have continued to, been there in the legal world, and have led to various different kinds of theorizations, various different kinds of judicial pronouncements. One of the, sometimes there is a tendency towards taking a numerical framework. So for example, the Kerala Education Bill argued that minorities should be less than 50% of the population. But it did not define whether 50% of what, or 15% of a state population, national population, district population, or this ultimately came to the TMA Pai judgment in 2002 came to argue that minorities have to be defined at the level of the state. At the same time, we also have national minorities, a list of them, which has been brought out by the central government, and the Minority Commission, for example, attends to it. So there is complete confusion in this context. Something interesting in the emergence of minorities as a constitutional category took place, that in the draft constitution, before the making of the final constitution, in the draft constitution, the SCs, the STs, the depressed communities, as well as the religious minorities were all clubbed together as a minority. However, this happened before the partition of the country. Once the partition of the country took place, the argument from within the nationalists and those who were the members of the Constituent Assembly emerged that now when the country had been partitioned, why should we extend certain kinds of rights to minorities? It was seen as a bargain. And since the minorities have now, particularly the Muslims, have been able to establish the state of their own, there is no point of extending special rights to them. And as a result, the minority debate was reopened with some of the Muslim members of the Constituent Assembly being prompted to forego the guarantees of guaranteed representation in the public service and the political process. It was a split. The definition of minority now was restricted to only linguistic and religious communities, whereas the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, the OBCs were taken out of the out of the framework of the minority. So the minority, question within the Constituent Assembly too had its own problems and ramifications. Many nationalists, although secular orientation, had different reasons for being a bit suspicious about minority as a category itself. The relationship between the minorities and Indian nationalism also depends on what kind of a nationalist discourse one adheres to. Predominantly at the time of the independence, the idea of as a follow-up of the national movement, the idea of composite nationalism, was what most nationalists would, subscribe to. But at the same time, if you look into the Constituent Assembly debates, that there is an apprehension regarding the term minority itself, and the whole argument being a typical nationalist framework which would insist that distinct identities should be discouraged. Every identity needed to be merged within the idea of the Indian identity, and as a result, extending any kinds of special protection to them was considered was to be discouraged. It was during this period, or a bit later, that this Indianization thesis was also forwarded. That Indianization thesis argued that minorities, particularly those who insisted on distinct language, distinct culture, etc., needed to Indianize themselves. By the cultural attributes of this Indianization thesis, the cultural attributes were, of course, drawn from the Sanskritic Hinduism. One of the most ardent argument was forwarded by Balraj Madhu, the leader of Jan Sangh at that point of time, but also subscribed to by many others, including those within the Congress. Secular nationalists too have had their own problem with the idea of minority, because minorities, of course, the insistence on distinctiveness extends to having distinct laws, particularly personal laws, distinct, the right to have their own religious institutions, such as, say, for example, seminaries, and sometimes it also extends to having their own medicinal practices, etc. So this distinctiveness has also not received much appreciation from the secular nationalists, who continue to insist that there should be that the secular state should take initiatives in order to ensure that these cultures, which are considered to be in some ways and sometimes taking extremely unprogressive kind of positions, that they are addressed and their influence minimized. And the third kind of nationalists, the pluralists, rely on the everyday religiosity, and they insist on minority protection, etc. But again, the argument which comes from liberal nationalists as well as secular nationalists is about how do we allow the culture to be frozen. Why do you take the culture to be frozen? Because every culture is also in a process of continuous reinvention and continuous internal conflict as well, and a continuous process of transformation. If we extend certain kind of protection, and this would arrest this process of transformation. So there are these kinds of questions which have come to impact the idea of minority within a nation state framework such as that in India. Sorry. In this talk, I also want to bring in the idea of minoritization, or the whole way in which the minorities are produced. Communities, as I argued earlier, may not necessarily be very comfortable with being declared as a minority. However, this whole process of the production of minority is also a historical process. And we can see that communities which did not see themselves as a minority, in certain situations started seeing themselves as a minority too. The case of the Sikhs is the most evident one, who saw themselves as completely integrated with the idea of Indian nationhood, irrespective of its predominant Hindu tendencies. Yet the Sikhs found themselves more or less comfortable or integrated with that idea. However, from the 1960s onwards, we see that there is a restlessness amongst the Sikhs around certain kind of questions, many of them emerging from Punjab specifically, and not necessarily all of them were questions of theological origin or cultural origin, but many of them were associated with the question about peasantry and and the autonomy of the of Punjab as a state, etc. And so from 1960s onwards, with the emergence of the Punjabi Suba movement, that we see that a distinct Sikh category, Sikh idea emerges, and a Sikh politics starts taking shape along these lines. But Sikhs actually claimed a minority status post 1984 when they were faced with massive violence. What I wish to argue is that perhaps the role of violence in the forging of boundaries and the reconfiguration of identities has not been studied to the extent it required to be. Collective violence exacerbates the process of minoritization and leads to communities forging boundaries, patrolling them, and becoming suspicious about other communities as well. Instances of collective violence, have been, episodic emergence of collective violence have been quite frequent in Indian political history since independence, even prior to independence too, but since independence, if we want to map it. And I recall one of the particular case from Assam, where a community called Na Assamiyas, those who are coming from Assam might know, the Na Assamiyas were those who were Bengalis settled in Assam, but had adopted Assamese language, Assamese culture, and started claiming themselves to be, presenting themselves as Na Assamiyas, the new Assamese. But During the Assam movement, they were faced with targeted violence. And one such violence was the Nelly massacre of 1983, which left more than 3,000 people killed within 3 to 4 hours. One of the scholars who studied the Nelly massacre, it has again been a very understudied, event. But one of the scholars who studied the, Nelly massacre tried to understand the reasons for the massacre, and particularly from amongst those who were considered to be the perpetrators. The tribals surrounding the Na Samya, localities were accused to have, were considered to have led the massacre. And the tribals argued that this was the moment in which they proved themselves to be the Assamese. By participating in that violence in the context of the Assam movement, the tribals who were otherwise not considered to be fully Assamese, this was their movement to claim that status. And so, violence or through violence, we can see that how forging of identities, forging of boundaries, emergence of communities takes place. Violence, again, one may argue, may accelerate the process of community formation, but violence alone may not necessarily be the only catalyst. This for researchers is important also then to look into the history of community formation and various kinds of different different kinds of trajectories which it adopts. No community as such of its claims of being a community or distinct community has continued to remain frozen in terms of its politics, in terms of its relationship with other communities, etc. Cultural boundaries have not necessarily been always so strictly maintained and have been always so cemented. There are times at which there are huge transgressions also takes place with neighboring communities in terms of languages being acquired, in terms of intermarriages, etc. But there are also moments when these become, completely frozen. So the question of collective violence, as I see, is extremely important in trying to understand the process of minoritization. So in that context, when we try to argue that whether minorities, like say for example, there was a case in Allahabad, I think in 2007, where a judge made a judicial order saying that in Uttar Pradesh, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, Muslims were a majority and the Hindus were a minority. He came to this absurd argument by suggesting that Muslims are a singular community without any internal differences, whereas Hindus are divided in terms of castes. So if we look in from that perspective, actually Muslims come to be a majority and the Hindus a minority. It is another thing that the higher bench immediately understood the absurdity of the order and put a stay on it. But this kind of idea that says that minorities can be produced at will and defined at any through these kinds of formulations, also need to consider that every community is at the receiving end of violence and not at all historical junctures. So if minorities, of course, are cannot be perpetual, permanent categories, but at the same time, one has to understand that how violence comes to give a certain kind of fixity to this idea of who constitutes a minority. Unless and until this majority-minority relations go for a certain kind of a transformation altogether, Minorities continue to see themselves as those who are deprived of power and are, suffering on terms of targeted violence, etc. In such a situation, there would be more tendencies, and which is very evident, that there are more tendencies towards patrolling cultural boundaries, towards insisting on, on maintaining, cultural identity, purity, etc. And very often, women who are seen as emblems of culture come to suffer on this count. So I wish to insist on the idea of violence as critical to the formulation of minority identity. But at the same time, I would also argue that this idea of violence comes accompanied with this notion of minority and majority in a certain kind of a relationship. That relationship is of dominance and subjugation, but there are possibilities of transformation as well in this relationship. So therefore, without extending any kind of a permanency or any kind of perpetuity to this who constitutes the minority and the majority in a given context, I wish to argue that we as theorists or scholars need to understand as to in each and every context, how do these relationships emerge, what implications do they have, and how have they changed over a period of time. One example of which I would say is that, say, for example, Biharis in Maharashtra are seen as a minority when they face violence led by the Shiv Sena, or have faced violence when led by the Shiv Sena. But the same Biharis in Bihar may not necessarily see them as themselves, or even in North India may not see themselves as a minority. Bengalis in Assam have been continuously facing different kinds of exclusions at different periods of time. So, but not necessarily in Bengal as such. So the importance of the context and the nature of relationship between majority and minority needs to be, examined and studied to come to any, comprehension about what constitutes a minority. Having said that, I come to argue that there are three different kinds of minorities in India, but all these three different kinds have their own, problems as well. First, I would argue are those which have been considered as nationalities. These are communities who have a certain kind of association with homeland, the Bodos, the Nagas, the Mizos, etc. They have in the past insisted on self-governing rights. Also, amongst them, there could be some who have gone to the extent of arguing for secessionism. The Nagas definitely have. The Mizos also at one point of time. The Tamils renounced their secessionist ideas, but the Kashmiris retained it for a long period of time. I don't know what is going on now in Kashmir, but definitely that has changed quite substantially. Now, so these are communities who insist on maintaining this overlap between political and cultural boundaries. That the Nagas, the association Naga homeland, the Mizos with the Mizo homeland, the Bodos with the Bodos. There are again problems here which are inherent. The first problem is none of these identities are settled identities. Sajal Nag, one of the scholars of a historian from Assam, argues that how Naga identity is in a continuous process of making and unmaking. There are certain groups tribes who join the Naga identity, the others leave it. Same goes for the Mizos as well. Besides, there are minorities within. And therefore, in that sense, this whole idea of self-governing rights on the claim of being a persecuted minority loses its moral high ground in some sense, because it does not address the question of minorities within. The second kind of a minority are those, I would say, are the indigenous groups, which are smaller communities, do not have any particular claim over homeland as such, but nevertheless they have certain ideas of traditional language, script, animism of some sort. They are protected by the Indian Constitution by Schedule 5 and Schedule 6. But at the same time, sorry, today they are faced with various different kinds of incursions, including the assumption that they're sitting on huge resources, mineral wealth, etc., and therefore have had to suffer on accounts of capitalist expansion. And the third kind of minorities, who actually are more frequently referred to as minority in the Indian context, are the dispersed minorities. These are the religious communities as well as language speakers which are not confined at their own homelands. These dispersed minorities, you may say Muslims spread across the country, do not have any claim over a particular area as what they claim was in the past, but no longer now. Same goes for Christians or others. But here the expectation continues to be completely different. There's no self-governing rights, neither protections of Schedule 5, Schedule 6, etc. But what is expected is, depending on what kind of a specific nature of grievance which each of these communities have. Muslims, a large proportion of them, particularly in North and East India, suffer from extreme backwardness and deprivations, material deprivations. They could also be, faced with targeted violence frequently, and therefore security as well as certain amount of equity is what would they expect. Besides cultural protection, but the priority of security over any other thing is, goes without saying. The Sikhs, for example, have a different kind of an expectation altogether. Similarly with the Christians, these are the communities may not suffer hugely on account of material or economic disparities, but again, the question about security, cultural protection remain very strongly there. These three kinds of different minorities, when we as we analytically separate them, this analytical separation trying to also helps us in trying to understand the relationship with the nationalist discourse. The nationalities as well as the dispersed minorities have their own kinds of problems with the predominant nationalist discourse. But as in terms of what ought to be, one may also argue that there are also ways of resolving it without necessarily being suspicious about each other. Should I stop here? I believe I have taken enough time.
Wind up, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So the finally, I would like to say that community consciousness, which emerges through both processes within the community, but at the same time how the communities come to have come to see themselves in a particular political and social context. Here in this case, therefore, it is important to see and understand what kind of relationships are emerging, and not only with what we say is the majority. In some places, I have tried to suggest that it is a national public. But at the same time, the orientation of the state plays a very critical role. So therefore, I would argue that there needs to be a triadic conceptualization of identities, in which the communities are not, as analytical categories, are completely independent, as they are in a certain kind of a relationship with both state as well as the national public. To what extent the state actions are legitimated by the national public? What kind of a relationship do the minorities have, a particular minority have with the national public? it comes to be extremely important in that sense. Uh, and this may vary depending on which community and what kind of its history of political exclusivism as well as its political activities, and what ways have they unfolded. If we understand it in those ways, we will be able to comprehend this nature and its the way in which community formation is taking place, the way in which how it is placed in a particular context. So this triadic framework is extremely important to understand rather than studying groups in isolation. Thank you.
So thank you, Tanweer, for this very comprehensive and very clear presentation. So though we were running out of time, I didn't want to stop you because there was such an internal coherence as you developed it. I would open it up for any questions or comments, but I was very struck by your attention to context and the kind of processual making of communities and your final argument about how it has to be put in the context of its relationship to both the state and the larger national discourse, and not seen as an isolate, which has been a tendency within the practice of sociology of seeing communities more in attributional framework rather than relational. So any questions or comments, you could use the chat.
Ma'am, there is someone who is going to ask a question. Kritika.
Kritika, yes.
Hi. Tanweer sir, thank you for the presentation. I had two questions, more in terms of clarification. One is, how do we understand the idea of national public? Are we speaking in terms of statistical, since we spoke of the typology here, either in terms of relational or statistical? So how do we understand the idea of national public? And second, has there been, since you said violence is an important part of how we understand minority, could you please, so my research is on minority women in Hyderabad, and I'm coming across literature on something as the process of slow violence, right, which is systemic and structural, that particularly women from the minority communities experience as an everyday form of violence, right? So could you please distinguish what sort of violence are we talking about? Are we speaking in case of extreme examples of massacre? Because you have also given examples of massacres in Assam and in places. So could you please elaborate on the idea of what sort of violence, what is the threshold of violence that we are working with when we understand it? I hope my question was clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Kritika. Should we take more questions or can I go ahead?
Ma'am is gone offline. I think take a couple of questions more. One has come in the chat. That is, sir, would you like to talk about colonialism and the formation of majority-minority communities in India? Did Muslims constitute a minority before partition? I think a little bit you had mentioned on that. Yeah. That's another question which has come.
Well, okay. So, well, let me attempt to respond to these two questions. First one is Kritika's, how do we come to define or understand what constitutes a national public? It is again something to be contextually understood, and because, as I said earlier as well in the beginning too, even the majority may not necessarily be a majority as such. If we argue that Hindus are majority in India, but at the same time they are linguistically separated, there are multiple nationalities within, and there is no commonality as such when it comes to even culture. However, in a given context, vis-a-vis a particular community as such, the national public acquires a particular kind of a role. Now, say for instance, the Sikh demand for Khalistan. Today, if a Sikh stands with a placard demanding Khalistan anywhere, he might immediately be persecuted as well, but prosecuted too. But same thing if you know, a member of the BJP comes with a placard saying Bharat Hindu Rashtra hai, or we want to make India as a Hindu Rashtra, there won't be any outcry as such. Leave aside, and there have been enough number of incidents of such sort. There have been so many dhams as such held in which these proclamations have been made. But at the same time, there have been no kind of a police action or national outcry. But when a Sikh does it, or anyone else, even we ourselves would find it very difficult to defend it. So that I'm trying to say, in a particular context, this is how we can understand what national public, who constitutes the national public, and who claims ownership over the nation as well as this nation state. So irrespective of what is the internal differences, but there is also a symbolic construction of community. Dalits are internally different. Multiple caste groups come to constitute the Dalit as a category, but at the same time, so there are no commonality amongst them. But at the same time, there's something which is experiential, which is symbolic, which makes them part of a Dalit whole. So similarly, I would say that this national public is also symbolically constructed in a given particular situation and context, depending on what kind of a relationship it has with the minority in question. Okay. The other question about violence. Yeah, I'm not really talking about violence in terms of its spectacular form alone, although my examples were there. These are extreme cases in which the reconfiguration of boundaries and community identities take place. But also there is, as we are all familiar with, this whole idea of structural violence, which is systemic, which is not spectacular, which may not take physical form, but at the same time it is experienced. So yeah, violence has its own range, but nevertheless, violence does play a role in the formation of community ideas and consciousness. That is what I have come to understand. The questions about majority and minority, the role of colonialism. See, unlike some nationalist historians, I don't believe that colonial, rule necessarily by design created divisions within the, in India. While there were some attempts at that as well, but much of it also happened because of the colonial statecraft, which is not much different from the modern post-colonial statecraft as well. So when we talk about, say, for example, census and the role of colonial census in the formulation of community identities. So Sudipta Kaviraj, for example, had a paper that how fuzzy boundaries became, fortified communities because of the census and the number associated with it. But those processes continue post-independence as well. So modern, identities emerged. Hello. Yeah. They went through a process of, change and transformation. It was part of this change and transformation, they also acquired the status being either a minority or a nation. These, ideas did not exist as such. There may not have been also an idea of Muslims, say for example, or Sikhs, say for example, constituting a singular community prior to the emergence of the Singh Sabha movement in the 1925, or a similar process happening amongst the Muslims around with the rise of the Muslim League and others. So colonialism or colonial statecraft did have a role, but not all entirely necessarily by design, as divided emperor was what, say for example, historians like Bipin Chandra would say, that communalism ultimately was the colonial states, conscious effort to divide communities and thus rule, divide and rule. But then, how do we understand its its emergence in even much more uglier form post-independence? No, there has to be something more than that, which needs to be explained, and that is why I would say that let's look at the sort of a modern statecraft and how it also results in the forging of identities, emergence of social categories. Many such categories which did not exist earlier are now come into existence because of the legitimation by the state.
There are quite a few questions.
Okay. India is a sovereign socialist democratic republic, so asking for a separate state is against the constitution, right? Could you please reflect on UCC? Okay, I was expecting that. Sir, thank you for the wonderful lecture. May I know how you look at the ongoing violence in Manipur? Minority majority is a global issue. I think I began with that, that how minority and majority are global issues, and everywhere it is riddled with its own problems. And therefore, to come to a all-encompassing definition is probably very difficult. And that is why I said that even the UN has not been able to come to any conclusion regarding what constitutes a minority, and then the extension of minority rights. Although it has made proclamations about protecting the culture, religion of minority groups. So far as UCC is considered, the UCC, there are two kinds of arguments, advanced for UCC. One came from, the left feminist position, which argued that how the personal laws were defined by religion. They were, as I said earlier as well, that they were gender unjust, that and therefore they needed to be replaced by a uniform civil code, which was more modern, which recognized the equality of individuals irrespective of genders, etc. So that was one argument. The other argument which has come is rests on this whole nationalist pitch, which argues that why should minority groups have their own distinct civil laws, one nation, one law. But here the fear, of course, is that it will be the law of the majority which will be imposed on those others, and therefore the resistance, irrespective of the the two different approaches to understanding UCC. The UCC, I think, will have its we are not still aware that what does it constitute. We have a lot of sloganeering around it, but what does it specifically constitute? How will it address the huge diversity of India? It is not simply the question about the Muslims or the Christians, but the questions are also about the sects, about the tribals, about the Buddhists and others. What are considered to be Indic religions are right now covered by the Hindu Code Bill. The Buddhists, the Jains, as well as Sikhs. But there is a lot of resistance from within. The Sikhs insist on their own ideas. Similarly, the Buddhists as well. And there is a discomfort which exists. But because of the smaller numbers, probably they have not been able to. I'm particularly talking about the Buddhists and the Jains, not been able to oppose it in the way in which as virulently as others might. So one has to understand what does UCC ultimately mean and what does it wish to address.
So are there any other questions?
The first question is about asking for a separate state is against the constitution, right? Yeah, it is against the constitution, yes.
Any other? Yeah. So, Dr. Joseph, should we sort of slowly wind it down? Yeah.
I think so. There were one question on a little earlier, whether neo-spiritual organizations lead to neo-nationalism and neo-ethnocentric approach in the chat.
Yeah.
That was there. Yeah.
Second last, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And then the question on Manipur. And that's it.
Well, unless we are discussing any specific case, it will be very difficult to argue, because neo-spiritual organizations are of different kinds. They may not, some of them may completely dissociate themselves from any kind of political expression, and whereas others who may be lending a certain kind of a helping hand to the process of politics, exclusion, and others. So when one has to be very specific about which particular neo-spiritual movement are we referring to. Yeah, so it will be difficult for me to answer that.
Question on Manipur, I think. Tanweer is the last.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I missed that, yes. Well, ongoing violence in Manipur will also have to be looked from a triadic framework, and then try to see how a minority community vis-a-vis a majority, and then the relationship with the state. There is you have the hill tribes, then you have the dominant Maitrayees, and then there is a central as well as the Manipur state itself. The state may have allowed, in some situations may allow some dominant groups to go ahead with the kind of violence they enact against the minorities. In other situations, the state may act strongly and impartially. It also depends on therefore that how is the state and its conduct is being. In the case of Manipur, it is very, very evident that the central state has allowed the situation to worsen, and in such a situation, the minority community within Manipur was faced with violence. There might have been some amount of violence from the other side as well, but that is always the case. You cannot expect any in a situation of violent exchanges that only one side will be at the receiving end all the time.
I think exhausted the questions. Yeah, and thank you so much, Tanweer, for this very, very comprehensive presentation with the emphasis on the context, because things change. I mean, even about Manipur, say during the mentioned about Nelly and the Assam movement, at which point there was an imagining of all seven sisters, which would include all the states, whereas then you have divisions within, which would crop up at particular juncture, which is probably true even about Maharashtra, where you mentioned about at which point who joins what, So the question of power and exclusion and the relational thing has to be done. I was also struck by that question which was asked about the neo-spiritual movements. And maybe Dr. Joseph, at some point, the RC could have a session on that kind of new trends, because they may have very different kinds of political or no political articulation at all, which would fit in within this research committee. So thank you very much, Tanweer. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. And for all who have attended it and participated in large numbers, we look forward to many more lectures. But remember, those who have missed it live, it will be uploaded with a little bit of editing, takes a week or 10 days on the website of the Indian Sociological Society. We are trying to activate all the social media platforms, the Facebook, So do visit the website of the ISS to get a sense of what the events are in future. Thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And to conclude, once again, thank you, Professor Tanweer, for that enlightening lecture and also answering all the queries that came up. Thanks to Professor Maitrayee for the encouragement and for being there, chairing the session as well. And thanks to ISS office, particularly to Boino and others for all the technical support. And yeah, and very much thank you for that. And thanks for all the participants, all who actually participated actively. And Professor Tanweer, you'll have to make Indian Sociological Society the host now. That's that. Okay, thank you. So thanks one and all, and we'll sign off. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph, and thank you, ISS. Thank you, ISS President and all the participants for patiently being here and hosting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.